Hello and welcome to this installment of the Chinese Business History webinar here at the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences. I'm Ghassan Moazin, an assistant professor here at the Institute, and I'm also joined by Dr. John Wong, who with me co-convenes the Chinese Business History cluster at the Institute. So today we're very happy and honored to welcome to the webinar Dr. Matthew Lowenstein, who is a Hoover Fellow at the Hoover Institution. He was educated, he received his PhD from the University of Chicago, and he is an economic historian that works on both late imperial and Republican period China. And he previously also worked as a securities analyst, so he's perfectly has a perfect background for the kind of thing that he's going to talk to us about now and that he's doing in his research in general. So today he is going to be talking to us about, so the title of his talk is New Perspectives on the Qing, Using Popular Sources, Data Analysis and Accounting to Reconstruct Traditional Economic Practices. Before I hand things over to Matt, I should say that the format is going to be roughly 30 minutes of presentation, followed by some 30 minutes or so of Q&A. If you have any questions for Dr. Lowenstein, please submit them through the Q&A button in Zoom, and then I will read them out during the Q&A period. But without taking up any more time, Matt, if you're ready, then please feel free to get started.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Ghassan. Really, really happy to be here. Yeah, let me get my slides up. Great. All right. Can everybody see my the PowerPoint?
Yep.
Okay, terrific. So yeah, today I'm going to talk a little bit about this new, or maybe not brand new anymore, but increasingly available source of historical material and some of the methodological challenges it poses, and how you can go about it. This is in part a sales pitch, trying to convince folks who are researching Qing and Republican era China, particularly business history, but really anything that gets into the lower reaches of society, that this source base might be useful. So first, what are these sources? These are popular sources, or 民间文献, 民间资料. Some of you will already be pretty familiar with a number of sources in this genre, but they mainly refer to where the sources are held. So an archival source is held in an official archive, and 民间资料 is a document that never was in an official archive and comes from is in a private collection, maybe now it's been published, but these are historical materials that are come through popular or non-state provenances, and some of them can be quite formal. They can be documents from old Qing era or Republican era companies. That's what I use. They can be contracts. Some of them can be, sort of more more scattered. They can be little advertisements or old bills that used to be passed around in the course of exchange. And the popular sources that I draw from the most, and which I highly recommend anyone of interest, anyone who's interested in look at, are this published collection from Shanxi province, and this is called the Jinshang Shiliao Jicheng. This comes from the private collection of someone named Liu Jianmin. He was a banker in Shanxi. He worked in the research office of the Shanxi People's Bank of China, and established a really astonishingly rich personal collection. And then when was it? Maybe I forget. In not so long ago, agreed to let some academics in mainland China edit and curate and then ultimately publish these sources. And the result is 88 volumes of Jinshang Shiliao Jicheng. And I have it, you can see on this slide, some of the kinds of materials that are included in this volume. So we've got contracts. We have something called a capital account or wan jinzhang. That's how Chinese traditional firms manage their invested capital and profits. We have share certificates. We have some unusual things too. We have some accounts from Roscas, which were kind of communal institution that I've written on, and I'll show you a closer example of that in a bit. But it's really an embarrassment of riches, and it would take about a lifetime to read all of them. So there's probably something in there for everybody. And these sources do pose a number of challenges. I think, broadly speaking, there are 5 different high-level challenges they pose: reading, understanding, interpretation, incompleteness, and representativeness. I'm going to address the first 3 in the bulk of this talk, and I'll sort of ruminate on the latter 2 challenges later in this at the very end. So first, for non-native speakers of Chinese, such as myself, reading these documents is extremely difficult. The penmanship, the calligraphy is actually quite good. So for a native speaker or anyone who has studied Shufa, they're not particularly hard to read. If you haven't studied Shufa, and in my high school we didn't learn Chinese calligraphy, they can be extremely difficult. And very briefly, I'll tell you what my mentors taught me, which is that if you haven't studied Shufa, the only way to read these is to spend a lot of time copying them out, character for character. I'm not sure why it works, but it does work. Over time, you get a feel for the script, and it becomes more and more intelligible. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge is understanding. Even if you can make out the characters, oftentimes you really won't know what the document is talking about. So reading is just table stakes. And here is a transcription of this document, and so you can see this is what it says in Chinese. After you read it, you may not know exactly what's going on here. So how do we understand it? How do we interpret it? Well, the methodology I use is based on something I learned from Shanxi University, which I studied these Minjian Wenxian with first with Cao Shuji at the Jiaotong Daxue, but then later with Professor Meng Wei at Shanxi Daxue, and a whole bunch of other really phenomenal scholars up at Shanxi. Yang Bo, Zhou Ya, some of you may know them. And Meng Wei has this basically this 6-point magic formula for tackling these Minjian Wenxian. And the first what you have to do is distinguish, identify, and locate. And this is part 1. That really means, what is this document? What are we talking about? And so here's an example. So this is the same document we were just looking at. First, we have to know, before we can interpret it, what exactly it is. Well, it is a piece of Piaohao correspondence. That means, the Piaohao were the Shanxi remittance banks. They were multi-branch banks, so they had branches all over the Qing Empire and then all over the Chinese Republic. And this is a page from a correspondence book. So there was a letter written from the Chongqing branch to another branch of this Piaohao, probably Hankou, the Hankou branch. This is not the original letter. These letters were copied into a correspondence book, a Xingao, for preservation, and that's what this is. So we'd like to know which Piaohao this came from. We'd like to Guihu even more. We can't do that with the information in this letter, but we can come pretty close. We know more or less what this thing is. The next thing we have to do, step 2 in Meng Wei's magic formula, is specification, the model, the format. So a lot of these Minjian Wenxian, particularly from larger businesses, but even from small contracts, they're extremely formulaic. They have a lot of boilerplate. You can't ignore the boilerplate. you have to know, what the formula is. And this is not that different from reading a business or a legal document today. If you look at it the first time, your eyes glaze over and you don't know, what all these different disclaimers mean. When you get used to it, they become very easy to read. And so these documents are no different. So these Piao correspondence are particularly formulaic and structured, and they open almost always with a serial number and the letter and date of the letter that is currently being sent, and it's followed with a record of the previous letter sent. So this way, the receiver knows that they have received all the previous letters; they're not missing anything. There's also probably some kind of anti-fraud mechanism here, in the same way that blockchain makes sure that you can't send a fake transaction. It's much harder to send a fake letter to a piao hao if you have to know what the previous letter was. Then they move on. They discuss the recent business contracted. Here it's saying and you can see there's these two characters, zibao. And after that, this means additionally, informing you basically, and then it'll go in. So 自报重号会过8月半交票摄影5000两，月底交3000两，致股东标收进宝银，共得利费银60两。So this is saying, okay, so we're sending, I forgot how much it was already, but 5,000 taels and then 3,000 taels from the Chongqing branch. These are going to be settled at the Taigu biaoqi, and the biaoqi is kind of a settlement system that the Shanxi merchants use. It's also telling us the fee is 60 silver taels on that. So a little more than 10%. Wait a minute. No, less than 10%. Less. I can't do math on the fly, but you can calculate it yourself. 60 divided by 5,000. Then they'll go and report other matters. So 进阶汉来信. So okay, we got this other letter from Hanko. And they'll go on to say what's happening. And here, what's very interesting is they're talking about actually a local bankruptcy in Chongqing, and I'll get into that in a second. And then the letters tend to end with market quotations. So people studying markets know people who want to look at prices of financial markets would find these materials quite useful, because they almost always end with some kind of quotation. So the fu bao characters that this starts with, that signals, okay, this means like telling you in passing. And then they're going to talk about local market conditions from where the letter was sent. And here we see that it's saying that the silver interest rate is 0.8%. That's a monthly rate. And it's saying that the money market price is 0.6. So I suspect that means 0.6 silver taels for 1,000 copper cash, but not actually entirely sure about that. So then that's step 2. So then we can kind of read this. Step 3 is we need a familiarity with the technical language, the industry jargon, customs, sometimes even regional dialect. There's not too much of that in this letter, but you'll occasionally run across some Shanxi Hua in these sources. So here we have an example of industry jargon. So this is the first one is hui guo. So this means, what does that mean? That means the Chongqing branch is sending a remittance. It's sending money to. Hui guo means that this was a remittance contracted in Chongqing that is being sent from Chongqing elsewhere. And then the remittance will be received at the Taigu winter biao. And so we need to know, what is the winter biao? What it is essentially a one of 4 seasonal quarterly fairs held at Taigu, at which they settle all kinds of contracts for long distance trade and for remittances. Some other interesting technical language here too. We can see that before it states any amount of silver at all, whether it's the principal of the remittance or the amount of the fee that's being charged for the remittance, there will be some kind of modifier before it. It'll state the kind of silver. So here it says 跳色银5000两, so 5,000 of 跳色 silver taels, and then the fee is denominated in 金宝银60两. And so that is these are the fineness of silver. It's the purity of the silver, and these relate to the standard not measurements, but silver used in these different markets. So Chongqing uses something called 漂色银. Shanxi uses something called 金宝银. And it's often said that 金宝银 is because it's so pure, it was like a mirror, and so it's a 金子. I suspect that's not the case. I suspect it just sounds like Jin, the province Shanxi, but it could be a mix. And then this Li Fei Yin, that means interest and fee income together. That's fairly straightforward. And then the final, and sometimes at first quite daunting technical jargon is the Suzhou Mazi. So these characters here are not Chinese characters. This is it's called Suzhou Mazi in the south. It's actually in the north, people often call it Shangmazi, business numerals. And this is a kind of a business shorthand for writing numbers. It's again another one of these things. It's very daunting when you first see it. You're like, I don't want to have to learn a whole new set of numbers. If anyone is interested in these sources, do not be intimidated by Suzhou Mazi. It takes literally 15 minutes to learn just by looking at Wikipedia. So this is a 5 and this is a 3. It's 5,000 and 3,000. Finally, oh wait, I don't know if this is finally, but step 4. When you're looking at a source, you want to know when it comes from. You want to know what the historical background is, what's going on. You want to contextualize it as you would do with any source. So this source in the published version is undated, but when you this letter, it's, I think in the Mulu, it's some kind like Mo Piaohao Mo Nian, something like that. But when we look through it closely, we can actually find enough evidence to date it quite precisely, because in this additional information area, it says 在兹月底又收过郑太昌缓息银200两. Zheng Taichang was a major Chongqing qianzhuang, so a locally based native bank. So it's not a branch bank. It just does business in Chongqing. And it went bankrupt, and it was quite a massive bankruptcy. A lot of other firms, a lot of other qianzhuang and commercial firms were affected. The Piaohao lost a lot of money in the ensuing fallout, and they agreed to a workout plan, as they would often did in bankruptcies back then, for this Zheng Taichang to pay back in installments. And this happened in 1888. So now we not only know what's going on in the background, this is sort of in the midst of a mini financial crisis, we also know when the letter is from. Finally, classification. So this is, I think, one of the harder ones to be, there's no one thing I can show you to explain what I think is meant by Lei Xinghua, Yao Xinhua, and Pu Xihua. But I think essentially you want to know how this source fits in to the larger universe of similar sources. You want to know that this is in a Xingao, so it was copied, as I said earlier, it was copied by someone who worked at the Piaohao from an original letter. And you want to know something about Piaohao's information management in general. So they're sending letters back and forth all the time. They're sending a monthly statement of their financial position, each branches, to headquarters and to neighboring sister branches. That way we can understand, like, why are they sending this letter? What is it doing? Well, it's enabling this Piaohao to balance receipts and payments in all of its branches. And then finally, comprehensive familiarity. So tracing connections. So how can you use these to draw broader conclusions about Chinese business or social economic history? And just a quick example that we've just seen. We can use this letter to find out a lot about the relationship between the Piaohao and the Qianzhuang, these two different kinds of indigenous banks. And we can also use this to start understanding what determines remittance rates, what determines different financial rates, what are important to actors in the financial market. And this bottom-up understanding of Chinese business, gives us new insights into the traditional Chinese economy. And now we'll go up into another example. So now that we've fleshed out kind of what the process is, what the methodology is, I'll show you something kind of neat from something that I did recently. So this is an account book from a qianzhuang, also found in the Jinshang Chiliao Jicheng. It can tell us actually a lot about how paper money circulated through the rural marketing system. More than you might think at first. And I'm not the only one who's looked at this account book, but I think this analysis is, if I may say so myself, fairly creative. So first, let's go back to this. What is this? So this is a schedule of various fairs held in Yuzhe, where this Qianzhuang was from. And it tells us where these different ganji, where these miaohui were held in the Yuzhe area. And we can confirm these dates with the local gazetteer. So this is definitely what it's saying. Then what we see is that this account book is a register of all the paper notes issued by this Qianzhuang. And here's the issue date on the right here. And then it has the receipt date, the date that they were canceled, on the bottom. So we know when these notes were issued. We know the size of each note, so the face value of each note. That's here, you can see that. And then the bottom, we know when the notes were retired. So we can map that on to the temple fairs. When were they issued? When were they retired? We can actually see what fair they were issued at and where they were retired. And we can trace the circulation of the notes through rural society. And so this, there's an old debate, how much do these things really circulate? Some folks think a lot. Wang Yejian thinks a lot. Niv Horace thinks they didn't really circulate very much. But here we can see that they did circulate quite a lot. And of course, these are straight lines because we only have the place of issue and the place of retirement of conversion. We don't know. They could very well have gone to many places in between. But at the very least, we can see that there's this catchment area around the Yuzhe County seat where these notes are flowing to and from. So that's one example. Popular sources also grant insights into all kinds of communal level institutions. So a qianzhuang operates in rural society and indeed in even more in the commercial market. There are also all kinds of communal institutions that we can look at in these sources, and one important one is called a Raska or a Hehui. This is from an article I have very recently. People have known about Hehui for a long time. basically everybody from Fei Xiaotong onward has written about them a bit. They're a community-based society for allocating credit, for accumulating savings and accessing credit. What I found, what's new in these popular sources is we can see that these Roscas were not just based on social trust. They were not just based on 感情 or like 熟人社会 or 亲属关系, although this surely played a part. But as with the rural lending market, they were based on fixed collateral, usually land, but also buildings. And here we can see an account book from a Rosca that tells the story of a guy, Wang Shenghai, who defaulted on his Rosca debt, and as a result, lost access to had to surrender some collateral. It's actually more interesting than that because you can see his financial position slowly getting worse and worse. He first he has to use his collateral for something else, and so he has to give new collateral to the Rosca. Then finally he goes bankrupt and he defaults, and the society head takes possession in what looks like a live sale, what looks like a yen of his former property. And then another thing, I'll just share some research that myself and Professor Cao Shuji has done. Well, Professor Cao Shuji and others really pioneered this, but he and I have an article out recently in Business History on accounting history. This is not from the Jinchang Liaoji channel. This is from a different set of sources from the Feng Tai salt merchant. I don't think they've been published yet. They will be published in the very near future. And it's a huge collection of salt merchant account books. And just the scale of them lets us ask more thorough questions about accounting history. So we're not just looking at one account book and trying to guess how the accounting worked. We can take 3 different account books and see how they were related to each other. So one transaction, and here this is a transaction where this client Jiaohe buys some salt, and this client Jiaohe buys some salt. Okay, how does this filter through the different account books? And we can see it hits first it hits the sale 2 different accounts as a sale, and then it hits 2 other accounts as a kind of accounts receivable. So great. So this is very relevant to me, relevant to a lot of people. Maybe you don't do financial history or accounting history. What else can you find in the popular sources? There's a lot on familial relationships. There are things on advertisements. So if you're anyone interested in branding, in visual culture of Chinese businesses, would do well to consider these. There's all kinds of stuff on the grain trade in the Republican period, which I haven't gotten into because it's not a priority. There's textbooks for children. So we know people talk a lot about Confucian education. Well, this is a different kind of Confucian education. How are you educated if you are the son of a merchant family? That's here. So it's really exciting. And then I'll just end on those 2 other challenges, and these are also partly caveats. So not every none of these, I should say, none of these sources are complete in the way that you will sometimes find in a formal archive. So there's not a single complete set of Piaohao accounts, even for a single year. That makes a network analysis impossible. This is tantalizing because they would have produced multiple such year-end comprehensive accounts in the course of business. None of them have survived. There's less than I would like from Yinhao, which are a different kind of important bank. And then in terms of chronology, it's often hard to tell a synchronic story because the available materials follows a power law. You get way more material starting in the Daoguang reign, and that goes up increasingly over time. And so it's kind of biased, you could say, in favor of later periods, and it also means it's easier to tell and come up with an analytic argument than it is to come up with a synchronic narrative. Other problems are representativeness. So Shanxi merchants are unusual. There's survivor bias in the materials. This is always a problem. Echoes of Elizabeth Perry's criticism of garbology. And so it's not perfect, but it's pretty interesting stuff. And maybe with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and we can throw open the floor.
Yeah, wonderful, great. Thank you so much, Matt, for this wonderful overview and kind of look into this particular group of sources. As I said, we now have some time for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A button in Zoom, and then Matt can get back to you. Maybe I can start us off. Like, I mean, I'm really fascinated with this particular source collection and how it actually came together. So I wonder whether you can talk a bit more about. I mean, you obviously said who Liu Jianming is and so on, but what do we actually know, and what do we not know about the provenance of these particular sources? How they actually, in the end, found their way from a particular piaohao to this particular collector, and then into this particular collection. I mean, for instance, is the collection actually is that like a complete copy of the collection of Liu Jianming, or is it selected there on that point as well? And in general, I wonder whether you can just talk a bit more about the provenance of these particular sources and how we get from the original piaohao to seeing them in this multi-volume collection.
That's a great question, Ghassan. I'm not sure, but I actually don't know, but I can speculate on it. I suspect that that it is fairly complete from Liu Jianming, but I don't know that to be the case. I know there are other folks with similarly massive collections that are in the process of being published. There's a massive collection of pawn shop materials that is slowly being curated for something like this. I suspect the provenance of these would have been just, things like flea markets and just open market purchases back in the day when they were affordable. It would be punishingly expensive to acquire a large collection of these sources today, but there was a time in the 80s and 90s when it was pretty cheap. No one wanted these things. I think that's particularly. I think that's you can see that these probably sometimes came from some family, because you'll for example, in a set of contracts, you'll get a whole bunch of contracts with one person's name repeated over and over again, and so that's likely to be, maybe not one of his descendants, but someone from his town. Somebody got a hold of that guy's of a piece of that guy's personal files back from the Qing. The piaohao are trickier. I really don't know where the piaohao correspondence comes from. Every once in a while, you get a couple correspondence books that come from the same piaohao and are in close proximity to each other chronologically. So presumably that's something similar. There's some employee or a shareholder of a piaohao got access to these records and it was passed down. But that's all to say that it's pretty za, and there wasn't sort of one central registry of piaohao files that's coming out of. Yeah. The best I can do is speculate.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. We've got our first question from our colleague, Dr. Peter Hamilton. And he's asking, I'd love to hear more about the textbooks for children. Who are the authors, and what do the lessons usually cover, and whether there are any examples you can point us toward?
Yeah, sure. I can absolutely point you to some examples. That's the easiest one to take. So if you go to the Jinshan Shiliao Jicheng, you can find the mulu on Douban, and there'll be a section with duben, primers, and you'll see them there. I've skimmed them, so some of them are just sort of moral exhortations. This is how you should behave morally. Some of them contain things like little bits of Mongolian. How do you say this in Mongolian? Because you're doing business on the frontier. Beyond that, I don't know, because I haven't really looked at these and don't plan to. So if it's something that anyone is really interested in, then I suggest they go do it and tell us what they find.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, no, that sounds very interesting, particularly the Mongolian.
Yeah.
The next question comes from Yang Liping, and it says, thanks, Matthew. Have these Shanxi merchant records been digitized? Reading them page by page is really challenging.
Yeah. Wait, so who wrote this? Who's this from? Yang Liping. Okay, great. Yeah. Oh boy. So sort of. You can a lot of them are on Duxiu. And Duxiu is also a real pain in the neck to read, because you have to use the search term and hopefully you get it. You can't search by title of the book. I don't think, at least I can. It will always tell me it's protected material. That's, as far as I can tell, the closest there is to a digitization. Lots of scholars do pass around sort of what I would guess are quasi-legal Genzaben. I couldn't possibly speculate on where you might acquire one, but that's so far the best you can do. There's no, as far as I can tell, there's no kind of PDF of them, unfortunately.
All right, thank you.
Can I jump in with a question?
Yeah.
That basically follows what I'm asking is basically following what your exchange with Peter Hamilton just now, with all the primers or whatnot. I wonder if we can get a little bit more information based on the materials that you've collected or that people have collected about the background of these accountants or bookkeepers, how they're trained, how they acquire the trade. And also to see if there is a separation in the training of someone to be literate, to be writing all those contracts or whatnot in characters.
Yes.
Someone who's keeping the numerate side of things, whether that distinction actually existed in that system of business management in their time.
Yeah, so you mean like whether there's specialization within families, sort of like, okay, this son does the numbers, this son does the letters.
Right.
Is that sort of like, yeah, that's a great question. I think you could I don't think you would get dispositive evidence from these Duban, but I think you could get enough to make a pretty well-informed guess as to how children were brought up to go into business. They also have some personal life stories from very few, but a couple from business people, and so probably read next to those and alongside some of the Wenshi Ziliao, which probably everybody knows about. I think you could use those to fill in a lot of blanks, and indeed come up with a fairly convincing and well-based in evidence guess as to how the sons of Shanxi merchant families were brought up to go into business.
Yeah, I'm asking.
Sorry, go on, John. Yeah,
I'm asking that question because I think if we look at say British merchant families or American families, you don't see much of that distinction. I mean, the letters are written by the same people who are entering the numbers as well. The specialization seems to have come later, but I wonder, based on these vast collections of account books, how that worked in the Chinese case.
So I see. I believe it's much the same. I think if you were going to business, you were expected to write well. You were expected to be literate. You were expected to be able to use a swanpan, to know your numbers. There's a fairly if you try to work your way up a firm hierarchy, there were fairly well defined roles, and the accounting at a small firm, the accounting office, the Zhangfang, and the correspondence office, the Xinfang, was one thing, and so you for sure get a lot of overlap between these skills. At a Piaohao, there are two different, these are two different roles. You have an accountant and you have people doing correspondence. If memory serves, I believe the accountant is usually a little higher up, but you can work your way up the corporate ladder, so to speak. There are other roles in business that probably don't require so much literacy, but I would guess if you're, I don't know where those folks came from, or if they're even staff in the same families. They're actually maybe I'll embarrass my colleague. There's a good friend and colleague online now, George Chow, is doing some great work on the family life of Shanxi merchants. So some folks are looking at this.
That's great.
Yeah.
Great. We have another question. This question comes from Dr. Rachel Zilberstein. And the question is, so thanks for the super talk. I'm currently working on the Bujing and can see how the magic formula is a helpful framework for understanding this kind of material. Interested in hearing you say a bit more why you call them popular sources rather than, say, commercial sources. I get that this is coming from the Chinese term, but popular doesn't seem to capture the socioeconomic range of both the creators and users of the texts.
Yes, I mean, you're quite right. I'm simply translating the Chinese term 民间文献. I think commercial sources would be would be a more useful way to classify that. For example, that Piaohao correspondence book and certain other commercial contracts. I would just say I would say that the way I would look at it is commercial sources could be if you have a Venn diagram, you have popular sources, you have archival sources, and then you have sort of commercial sources which straddle that line. Popular sources tell us where the sources come from. They don't really tell us what's in it. Same with archival sources. And since the reality is we get these commercial popular sources published in the same collections as we get really more sort of grassroots earthy materials, and those Rosca notebooks is an example. And that so I think I think this 民间文献 is still a useful term. That said, it's a good point. Most of these relate specifically to business, so at some point, if it would also be useful thinking about sources for business in general, commercial sources, and then you'd want to look at talk about these 民间文献, but you'd probably also want to talk about some of the archival sources from on Huiguan, or maybe the early banks, that sort of thing. That's how I look at it.
Yeah, thank you. The next question comes from Dr. George Chow, and he says there is an increasing number of local popular document collections available nowadays, such as Huizhou Wenshu, the most numerous, Qingshuijiang Wenshu, Shicang Qiyue, etc. What do you think is unique about the Shanxi documents?
Yeah, that's terrific question. Yeah, there's a lot of these. I've looked at some of the Shicang stuff. There's Qingshuijiang. There's all kinds of Huishang stuff, and there's some that Cao Zhiji is also published from Jiangxi, from those Hakka sources. So what is special about the Shanxi sources is the variety of genres. So this is actually a very similar point to what Rachel was just saying, that these are not merely contracts, and the other sources are not only contracts, but they're overwhelmingly. My understanding is they're overwhelmingly contracts. Now there's still variety within contracts. There's land contracts, there's timber contracts, there's purchase contracts, there's lending contracts. So there's variety. But here we're not just talking about contracts. We're talking about the internal account books of Shanxi merchant firms. That's extremely rare. We're talking about correspondence, letters that merchants wrote to each other. Again, extremely rare, except in the context of Shanxi merchants. And so I think these really are, pound for pound, they're kind of more valuable than other Minjian Wenxian we might have seen before, just because they give us insight into so many different aspects of the commercial world.
All right, thank you. The next question comes from Professor Yuanwei Peng. And he says, thanks, Matthew. Could you please tell us a bit more about your research projects currently based on these interesting materials?
Absolutely, and yes, Professor Yuan is one of the great Bizu, the great is at the vanguard of accounting history as well, and a history of lending and credit markets. So a lot of what I do is based on his really monumental research. Yeah, so what I'm doing now, first I'm writing a book on the financial system of the Shanxi merchants, and that takes up most of my time, and that's looking at their institutions, looking at their methods of exchange, and it's looking at different financial markets. Other sort of side projects that I want to do. At some point, I would like to do a closer look at the capital accounting, so the Wan Jin Zhang. But the one accounting article I did took so much time and so much brain damage that I don't know if I'll get to this anytime soon. Other research projects. Well, I'll market myself a little bit. I just published 2 papers on ROSCAs. These are the Hehui. One is on risk management of ROSCAs, and I showed you a little. I gave you a little teaser from one of those, and that's essentially showing that ROSCAs had all kinds of collateral requirements, much like lending markets, and so we should think of them as really economic institutions, not only mercenary or communally or moral economy institutions. And the other article on ROSCA is ROSCAs that I did is taking these different ROSCA account books and using them to calculate the internal rate of return from joining a ROSCA. So the internal rate of return is the effective interest rate that you get from on any series of financial transactions, and it's a useful measure because ROSCAs are too complicated to explain now, but basically they result in uneven financial payments and receipts between members, and so you can't easily compare your return, your financial return from joining a ROSCA to your financial return from making a loan, because in a loan it's very simple. You give principal, you get interest back, you get principal back. In a ROSCA, you're kind of paying, then you're getting money, then you're paying, and it's more confusing. But you can use this IRR to make these comparable, to force them to be comparable, essentially. And so I do that, and I find RRRs on average of between 2% and 6%. And if we look at a paper annualized, and that's these are extremely sort of reasonable rates. They're not oppressive. They're not exploitative, but they're not it's not charity either. These are in the same ballpark as rates that actually you, Professor Yuan, and your co-authors found in commercial lending markets. all over China. So those are the sort of that's what's keeping me busy with these sources.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm putting both the recent articles in the
Thank you,
chat.
Ghassan.
So
Yeah.
if anyone wants to have a look, please do. Yeah, do we have any other final questions for Dr. Lowenstein? I think if not, then Matt, what remains for me to do is to thank you so much for really giving us, this fascinating talk. We've talked about it previously, also with John. I think it's really important that we kind of share how we read these sources and kind of get a hang of how we can work together to, given how challenging these sources can be. And I think, what you've done today is really super helpful in this regard. And of course, we're also looking all forward to learning more about your own research on that is based on these wonderful sources. So thank you very much for all of that. Before we sign off, I should mention that we'll be back already in a week. So on the 24th of November, our very own Professor Elizabeth Sin is going to talk about her new research on the Ontai insurance company here in Hong Kong. So this will be a rather sort of Hong Kong focused topic. So please have a look out for that. But again, Matt, thank you so much, and thanks to all of you for tuning in. And please keep a lookout for our future events. So thanks to you, Matt, and thanks to everyone. Thank you very much.
Ghassan, John, a pleasure.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. All right. Bye-bye.